We are back today for another one-on-one interview. Quick thanks to our guys over at Ambush Sports Network. Check them out at Ambush Sports on Twitter for all things sports related. Joining me today, who I consider to be the number one guy in Canada for all MMA news, TSN's UFC reporter, Aaron Bronsteter. Aaron, how are you?
I'm good, Lyndon. Thanks for having me on.
Of course, I appreciate it. Before we dive right into the UFC, I had a couple questions about you and about your story. What was your introduction into MMA? When did it become something that led you to the career that you have now, and how did you get into things?
Well, I guess something of a long story, but I'll make a long story short. I started working in journalism probably in around 2005, 2006, in that area. And my first job was as a late night radio producer for a show called Sports Rage with Gabriel Morency. And I did that on Sirius XM radio. And he was really into mixed martial arts. And that's really where I started to get more into the sport, was just working with him, booking interviews with different fighters. And then from there, I ended up producing the MMA show with Mauro Ranallo. And I worked with Mauro daily, and the show was strictly MMA, and I had to jump right into that with both feet, and became really into the sport with Mauro and working with Mauro, and just kept learning more and more about it. And early on in my life, I was more into basketball. Like, I was into basketball back then as much as I'm into MMA now. I was, reading all the mock drafts, reading all the articles, subscribed to Slam magazine, all of that, and then my interest just shifted to MMA, and I like I mentioned, I jumped in with both feet and have really taken it from there. And then when I moved over to TSN, my job was to book guests for a TV show called Off the Record with Michael Landsberg, which had a lot of memorable segments with different mixed martial artists over the years. And from there, TSN got the rights to the UFC in Canada, and I kept pushing for us to do more UFC content. And my VP here, a gentleman named Ken Bolden, said, why don't you cover it? You know the sport inside and out. And it just kind of went from there. And we've been doing more and more coverage over the last couple of years, and I've really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Yeah, it's funny. I knew that there was a connection between you and Gabe. Gabe is somebody who I follow very closely. I have my whole life. Whenever he's in Vancouver, I try and get the chance to go and meet up with him during one of his recordings. So it's awesome to hear exactly three guys that I've looked up to in Gabe, Morrow, and Michael Landsberg have all had a part in it. But being an MMA reporter at the high level that you are, sometimes you obviously have to be asking those hard-hitting questions that might not go over the best with the fighters, or they might not sit well with fighters. And I was just curious as to how you push through both an interview and with your job and your positive outlook on a career when you do have those tough interviews. We can even just look back to when you were asking John Jones about preferential treatment, and it didn't necessarily go the way that you thought it would be. But I just wanted to know how you deal with those things and how you move on.
I don't really think about it, to be honest. My mindset going into an interview is always to ask the questions. It sounds so simple, and it is so simple, to ask the questions that I don't know the answers to and that I want the answers to. If I'm asking somebody a question where I already know what the answer is, it's a waste of everybody's time. Because if I already know the answer, chances are the person watching most likely also knows the answer. So I think that's a waste of the person that I'm interviewing's time, and a waste of my time, and a waste of my viewers or listeners' time. So I try to avoid those questions. And if I do end up asking one of those questions, it's just so that I can buy time so I can think of a better question for my next one, honestly. So again, going into these interviews and with John, that's what I wanted to ask him. So that's what I was going to ask him. I wasn't worried about his response to the answer, and I was actually quite surprised by his response to the answer, because I feel like he does deserve preferential treatment, and I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that sports, from a meritocracy standpoint, certain athletes do deserve preferential treatment because of their value. So I guess he didn't interpret the question as being asked in that kind of fashion, but I wasn't afraid to ask the question. I wouldn't be afraid to ask him tough questions in the future.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that answer. That's exactly it. When you do come into these interviews, you're wanting to ask the questions that, like you said, you don't have the answer to, and that people want to hear the answers from. So to hear you just continue on to trek through that's awesome to hear, and it's good inspiration for any aspiring reporters. Getting right into the fighters now. If you do look across the divisions, I think it's safe to say that there's an immense competition and intrigue in every single weight class. What division right now are you the most drawn to, and how do you see maybe the top five, six fighters setting up with upcoming fights?
I'm gonna have to go with a welterweight. Welterweight right now is so crazy. It's just there's so many moving parts, and you've got Usman as the new champion. You've got Woodley main eventing in Minneapolis against Lawler to try to get back into that mix. Van Askren's in that mix, even though him and Woodley are friends. He's not a very good matchup for a guy like Usman, in my opinion. You've got Colby Covington who's getting the next title shot. You've got Stephen Thompson, who I think is a nightmare matchup for Usman, but he just took a step back by losing to Pettis. Pettis is kind of a wild card because he's jumping between two divisions. Thompson's looking to bounce back. There's just so many different things. And Masvidal, of course, I've got to mention as well, taking on Ben Askren. So, and he says that he's been told he'll get a title shot if he ends up beating Ben Askren. So, and then, of course, you got Ponzinibbio and some other guys in that division that we're not even talking about right now. So that's the division that I think is the most intriguing going forward. There's just so many different possibilities.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think if you look at that division 1 through 10, exactly, we didn't mention Leon Edwards. We didn't even mention Darren Till, who was just the number 4 ranked guy before he had a devastating loss to Jorge Masvidal. Now he's obviously in some hot water, but that welterweight division to me is exactly stacked from top to bottom right now. If you do take a look outside of, say, the top 10 in the division or even at unranked fighters, is there any names that jump out to you as potential title contenders in the next year? I know a couple names that jump to me are obviously Johnny Walker. Macy Barber has stated she's on the outlook for it, and somebody who we're going to get to in a second here, Corey Sandhagen. I mean, if he's able to take on John Lineker this weekend, who knows?
Well, Sandhagen's a great example. I don't know where Peter Yan is ranked, but he's a guy that I think is going to be in the mix in bantamweight. Bantamweight actually has a lot of these different prospects right now that I think are on the up and up. Even a guy like Tom Dukin, while he hasn't fought in a while, there's a lot of intrigue with him. If he does come back, I don't know what his deal is right now, but he's been away from the game for a little bit. But those are the ones that stand out. You mentioned Johnny Walker. He's definitely somebody to look at. Even Jan Kudalaba, who's fighting this weekend, is somebody who is interesting. And then you saw Mikhail Olenjacek last week, over the weekend. And then you've got guys like Magomed Ankalaev, who, he suffered that setback against Paul Craig in his debut, but I don't think that's an indication of just how good this guy is. So there are a lot of different names. Alexander Rakic, another one who's fighting in June. There are some names that are definitely on the up and up in the UFC that I think we're going to see. And then a lot of the people that graduated from the Contender Series and started fighting, like a guy like Roosevelt Roberts, who's fighting this weekend, is a guy that I think has a lot of upside. I love looking at a lot of these prospects in the UFC and trying to gauge where they're going to be at in the future. And I think there are a lot of names that provide intrigue.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that the Contender Series is kind of supplying something. It may not be supplying as many names as the Ultimate Fighter was, but I think that the quality of those fighters seems to be much at more of a higher level when they are coming out of the Contender Series. And I was just reading an article about Roosevelt Roberts, and I think seeing what he does this weekend exactly will prove to be very interesting. So if we do jump right into this weekend's card in the Sunshine State, the main event, we see a title implication shot for Jacare Souza and a huge leap up in competition for Jack Hermansson. Do you think this is too much too soon for Jack Hermansson with a quick turnaround, or is this right where he should be?
I don't think it's too much too soon because we saw what he did to David Branch. And David Branch, to me, is like a consensus top 10 guy in the division. He just ran through him like a buzzsaw. Didn't take any damage in that fight. So I think Hermansson's a good matchup given the possibilities that are out there for Jacare. It seems like Paulo Costa, there's something going on preventing him from fighting. Romero got injured. So this is a tough matchup for Jacare. I think as Jacare gets older and this division starts getting younger, we're going to start seeing more and more big competition for these older guys like Weidman, Romero, Jacare. The only issue that I have with Hermansson, and I think is the biggest thing going against him in this particular matchup, is that he often relies on takedowns and submissions. And if he's going to do that against Jacare, it's basically like jumping into a sea of piranhas. So he has to, or I guess a sea of alligators, if you want to use his nickname. But that's what he has to worry about. And I'm interested to see what he can do on the feet and how he's going to try to, over the course of 5 rounds, avoid the submissions of Jacare because, obviously with Jacare, once you go to the ground, if you take him down or if he takes you down, you're in big trouble.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I was just reading somebody online, and they were saying that if Jack Hermanson does have the confidence to take this to the ground, he could end up in deeper waters. And they mentioned with the alligators than what he may think than what he might think he may be getting into. So I'm very intrigued for that card. And with Fight Night 150 being such a deep card and UFC vets on the prelims and talent across the card, a fight that I'm very excited for, and I just mentioned his name, was Corey Sandhagen versus John Lineker. Like Hermanson, it's a huge step up in competition for Corey Sandhagen, and Lineker coming back from a return of almost a full year off. What are your thoughts on the matchup, and what do you think it means for both guys?
Well, the crazy thing about Sandhagen is we haven't really seen him rise to his true potential just yet. I interviewed his trainers that are at Elevation Fight Team, and I interviewed them about Curtis Blades. They did a feature on Curtis Blades, and I was talking to one of the striking coaches. And I asked, when Curtis Blades joined to where he is now, like what out of 10, how would you rank his striking? And he basically said, well, Blades was a 0 when he came to us, and now he's about a 6. And I said, well, if he's a 6, who do you consider to be a 10? And he's like, guys like John Jones, Corey Sandhagen, and he mentioned a couple other guys. And I said, sorry, Corey Sandhagen, you think is a 10 out of 10 in striking? He said, yeah. He said, this guy's unbelievable. And then you look at what he can do in jiu-jitsu and how well-rounded he is. And the bantamweight division's going to have a problem on their hands with this kid. And, facing a guy like John Lineker, if he can get past him, then we'll know just how good this guy really is. Because John Lineker is going to march forward. I mean, we know what John Lineker is going to do. He's going to march forward. He's going to try to take their head off. He's tough to drop. He's almost impossible to finish. So we're going to see what Corey Sandhagen has. And I think that you mentioned him earlier as a guy that's kind of on the outside looking in that could be a champion one day, and I think he acknowledges that. He mentioned earlier this week he wants to be like Dominic Cruz, and he wants to beat Dominic Cruz. It just goes to show how high he's looking up the ladder in the bantamweight division.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think that if Sandhagen is able to have a great showing and win the fight this weekend against Lineker, the sky really is the limit. That's an awesome insight to hear what his coaches, how highly they do speak of his striking, because I remember hearing, this is probably a year ago now, Brendan Schaub was talking that while he was still training, Sandhagen came into the gym as just a raw young kid, and he was just speaking so highly of the talent that he had, and was just saying that if this is somebody who can determine themselves into the gym and really focus on it, that what they can accomplish there's nothing that's unachievable. So,
and I'd also heard that he was giving Dillashaw fits when they were training together, when Dillashaw was back in Denver at Elevation, or I guess it was the training center back then, the Muscle Farm Training Center. Apparently Sandhagen was giving Dillashaw fits in the gym.
And I could see that. I think his length proves difficulty for a lot of guys in that division, and like you said, with his striking being at such a high level, having that length can be a massive advantage for him. So
yeah, we saw Brandon Davis in the last time he fought, 5'11", moving down to bantamweight. I was backstage and I was interviewing him, and Henry Cejudo was the person that I interviewed right before him. And, they shook hands and said hi to each other. And, Cejudo's going for the title at bantamweight, and the size difference was massive.
Yeah, it's amazing to me how some of these younger guys, when they do first get involved in these higher level promotions, UFC, Bellator, when they're still able to take that weight off so easily, some of the things that they can do at a young age in those divisions, it proves very troublesome for a lot of the older guys who aren't able to make that weight cut.
Absolutely.
And lastly, Aaron, the UFC right now is on an incredible streak of amazing cards, exciting fights, and it doesn't look like it's going to be stopping anytime soon if you look at the next few months having events and matchups that I can't wait for. Is there anything that you're really looking forward to in the next upcoming months? I know UFC Ottawa is not far from you in the backyard. UFC 237 has Anderson Silva, Jose Aldo, Rose Namajunas. 238, Henry goes for the champ, and obviously 239 being International Fight Week. There's massive things to look forward to.
Yeah, Rose versus Andrade is one particular one that stands out, because you got just two such different types of fighters. And then you saw what Rose did to Joanna on the feet, and what Joanna did to Andrade on the feet. But I don't believe in this MMA map. Like, I think that rankings are irrelevant. I think that matchups are everything in mixed martial arts. I think that there are a lot of people that are ranked in the top three that would have fits with unranked guys or people that are ranked really low in the division. And I think that a lot of it is irrelevant in terms of standings. And I think that they're just there to kind of build a picture of who's in the title mix. But I don't think that it speaks to who can beat who and who's better than who and all of that. I think that, and I actually think who's better than who is completely subjective because you're looking at matchups. And the crazy thing about Rose versus Andrade is I just don't know. I don't know how this matchup's going to go. There's just so many possibilities. You know, I can picture Andrade running through Rose, pushing forward, like similar to John Lineker that we mentioned earlier, just pushing forward, throwing major strikes. And then I can also see Rose figuring out ways around that, figuring out ways to use her length to her advantage, like Joanna did against an Andrade, and keeping Andrade from getting in that pocket. So that's one that just really intrigues me from an X's and O's standpoint.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that card is so interesting because when they were first starting to put it together, they were kind of unsure. I know Aldo had some health issues that they were unsure if it was going to happen, and then people were kind of looking for Anderson off of his fight with Stylebender if he was going to be having another big name because he did have such a great performance, and to get a Jared Cannonier wasn't exactly the huge name that he was looking for. But again, like we were just talking about, there's some guys that aren't necessarily having the rankings that can do a lot of damage in those divisions. So I think that entire card is extremely, extremely exciting to see.
Yeah, I think it'll tell us a lot about what Anderson Silva has left as well. I mean, a guy like Cannonier is somebody who is coming up in that division, but Anderson Silva has been fighting the best of the best, and now he's fighting somebody like a Derek Brunson who he beat back in Brooklyn a couple of years back. So I'm interested to see what Anderson Silva has left in the tank.
I agree. Again, Aaron, thank you so much. Have a great fight week. Keep doing what you're doing because you are a go-to for all MMA fans. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Lyndon, and same to you. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep grinding away and working on this, and hopefully you can make a career out of it.
Cheers. Much appreciated. Aaron Bronsteter, guys.